Wow.
Beautiful.
That was gorgeous.
It opened up to the exact page.
The exact page. Didn't even touch a piece of paper.
Yeah.
That's the good shit. Welcome.
Welcome.
This is Whiskers, Witches, and Wine.
Yeah.
Yeah. I really thought I was going to mess it up.
I know. I always want to say Whiskers, Whispers, and Wine.
Yeah. Well, no, I actually am the opposite. I want to do Whispers, Witches, and Wine.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
Anyway,
hi. How you doing? It's some date, and we're gonna read a story to you. Not just any story, though. This isn't a 1,000-word story. This is her story.
My story.
She has been... Here, I'll let you explain it, actually.
So, I have been unemployed for the past year, and...
Great way to start.
I mean, I feel like that explains a lot. In order to not go insane, I have written a lot, and that has resulted in a series of books. And TJ doesn't like reading, but I really want him to read my books, so we are doing this instead. He's going to read them out loud to me. So this is Witch in Progress, the first series, or the first book in A Journey Through Magic and Myth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure is.
I love that I have to open it to, remember what I titled it. It's fine.
Wrote this whole big book series. Can't remember the title, though. That one's
fine.
Lost from the memory.
Yeah, it's fine.
Now, I have not read this before. Right, I haven't. We already said that. We have already tried to record this once, and it did not go well. So I've read a little bit of this before.
But it's also changed since then, because
It's true.
It's a constant work in progress.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it'll still be a little different, just mostly the same. I imagine you didn't rewrite the whole thing that we've read, though.
No, I just changed the name of a character and, some things. It's not a main character. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I noticed that the
table of contents is now accurate,
is
yes.
now accurate. The
Yeah.
first chapter is actually only 3 pages long.
No, it starts on page 3.
Oh, okay. I was like, what?
No.
Batman. So I think we should really just get into it.
Yeah.
All right. Chapter 1. The Raven Mansion. A densely populated line of trees line the old train track and block the stream of mid-October sunlight from breaking through the train windows. The rays that did break through turned into a pleasant light green glow within the carts. This dark forest that raced by outside was observed by a pair of empty gray eyes that belonged to a young woman who sat curled up in one of the window seats. She watched the pleasantly green scene outside without really seeing it, her mind enthralled in the fight she had had with her father the previous night. She could still hear the anger in his voice. "What were you thinking, Isabella? What would your mother say?" Mother. That was the word that had brought Isabella back to her senses after having spent the evening feeling like a nervous wreck, racked with guilt and worrying about how her father would react to Isabella being arrested for going on a joyride in a car that wasn't hers. "What would she say if she saw you?" she had spat back. "You've barely been at home all this year, and you think you still get to have a say in what I do?" It had been a cruel thing to say, and she knew it, but it was true. Her father worked so much that he was barely ever home. They hadn't even had a dinner together as a family in over a month. What made him think that he had any right to step up now? "I'm your father," her father had replied, with a stony face. "Telling you what to do is still my job. You were our father," Isabella had replied hotly. "But you haven't been our dad since Mom died." Isabella could see her father's face so clearly that he might have been on the train with her. He had heaved a great sigh, and Isabella had watched as his whole demeanor collapsed in on itself, abandoning the aura of parental authority that he had been wearing for 2 decades. She almost apologized right then and there, but that little voice in her head told her to hold back. This was their chance to have an honest conversation for once. "You're right," he finally admitted, taking a seat at the dining room table and hiding his face in his hands. "I haven't been a good parent lately." Back in her seat, Isabella was vividly reminded of the shock she'd felt at those words, at her own father admitting that someone who wasn't him could be right, and then the fury at the words that followed. "Maybe it's time your grandparents had their chance." A stunned silence had fallen over the dimly lit dining room. Then a thud outside the closed door had shaken Isabella back into action. In hindsight, she wondered if it had been Carmen on the other side of the door, eavesdropping on their conversation like Isabella herself had done so often when their mother had still been alive. Mom hated it here, Isabella had spluttered at her father. She refused to even let us visit them. Why? Because. Her father exploded, his fist slamming onto the surface of their expensive dining room table. You've proven time and time again that you are as irresponsible as you are disrespectful. You need a firm parental hand to guide you, and if I can't be that for you, then perhaps your grandparents will succeed where I have failed. Isabella could do nothing but stare as her words failed her completely. Clement, her father, the renowned surgeon and the proudest man she knew, had admitted defeat. It was worse than that. He'd given up on her, on raising her. It felt like he'd given up on their family. What about Lucas and Carmen? Isabella had managed to ask him, that oh-so-familiar burning behind her eyes as they swelled with tears. Are you shipping them off too? As long as they continue to live by my rules, they will be welcome here. Clement's icy-cold voice echoed through Isabella's head as she twisted uncomfortably in her seat, silently cursing the train that was taking her further and further away from everything and everyone she'd ever known. Her life had made her miserable, sure, but it was her life. Clement hadn't listened to her arguments. He didn't care that she would be leaving in the middle of her senior year, or that she didn't know a single soul outside of New York, or how abandoned this all made her feel. Clement had simply called Isabella's grandparents, made the arrangements, and bought a train ticket before the break of dawn. Soon, she would be arriving in the small town of Midnight. Midnight, Isabella scoffed to herself as her eyes floated mindlessly across the blurry landscape outside. Who names a town Midnight? And what does that say about the people who actually choose to live there? When Isabella, after an intense night of crying and wishing that her father would come down with every disease known to man, had called her friend Nicole to share the horrific news, she had only confirmed Isabella's worst fears. Midnight? Nicole had repeated in a strange voice that after letting Isabella vent out her feelings. Sounds familiar. Wait, is that the place where everyone was, in a cult or something back in, the 80s? That would definitely explain why Mom wouldn't let us visit, Isabella had replied, wondering if perhaps Clement wasn't sending her there to find religion. Fat chance, she thought angrily to herself. I know better than that. I have family near Midnight, Nicole continued, unaware of Isabella's inner dialogue. And they're always talk about how weird that place is. You know, people who move there apparently never leave? I'm sure that won't be the case for you, though. But hey, if you find yourself on the run, at least you have a place nearby where you can stay. I'll text my cousin and let her know. Tears once more filled Isabella's eyes as the overwhelming gratitude she felt for her friend coursed through her, and she had thanked Nicole at least a dozen times before finally hanging up the phone. Isabella hadn't had many friends growing up aside from Lucas, on account of her being too weird for high society families. So having someone as loyal and considerate as Nicole around really was a blessing. Not to mention the way that Nicole was always more than happy to indulge Isabella's less than healthy methods of coping with loneliness and family issues, like smoking and stealing bottles of booze from Clement. Isabella knew that she had been...
Just the way you read that, I like it. Stealing bottles of booze from Clement. It was just cute.
Isabella knew that she had been a big disappointment for both her parents. They wanted the picture-perfect kids and had managed to get 2 out of 3. But Isabella had always been the black sheep of the family. She didn't do well in school like Carmen, she wasn't popular like Lucas, and she had no actual career goals or big dreams for her life. All she wanted to do was listen to good music, smoke a little weed, and maybe travel. Just not like this. Neither Isabella nor her 2 siblings had ever met their maternal grandparents. Their mother had almost never spoken about them or even hinted at their existence unless prompted, and when she died 7 years earlier, her kids had all assumed that the window of opportunity for meeting their extended family had been closed forever. The only time Isabella had heard her mother actually speak about her parents had been the day before she died. Ooh.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is the wine aspect of the Whiskers, witches, and wine.
Yeah, the main aspect for my part. I really just sit here, look pretty, and drink wine. I mean, what's not to love?
Answer questions and tell me when I said something wrong. But
I mean, I'm great at that.
We haven't seen the Whiskers or the witches portion yet.
Well, we have a Whiskers right there.
Do we? Oh, shit, we do. Hey, babe.
He's like, what the fuck are you doing? Don't touch my tail.
That's my tail. Don't do it.
He's so cute. Anyway.
Yeah.
And the witches are coming.
Oh, I trust that. It had been the middle of the night, and Isabella had been hiding in the shadows outside of the dining room where her parents were in the midst of an argument. Isabella remembered the sound of her mother's voice clear as day, and she recalled how frightened she had sounded when she told Clement about her stalker. Normally, her mother had been a fierce and proud Catholic woman, never backing down from a fight and never afraid to stand up for herself. It had been unnerving to hear her sound truly scared. "What if we bring them up north?" Clement had asked quietly. Through the crack in the dining room door, Isabella had seen her mother's shadow make a sharp 180 towards her husband. She'd really been the epitome of grace in those elegant suits and sharp heels. "To my family?" she'd asked with a horrified expression. "You know how I feel about them, Clem. They wouldn't be safe there." "Well, apparently they're not safe here, either," he had snapped back. A full minute passed before either of them spoke again. "What do you suggest we do?" Clement's voice had sounded drained and defeated, as did his wife's when she finally replied. I don't know. The conversation had ended there, and the following morning, Isabella's mother left for work and never returned. Clement received a call from the police later that evening, telling him that his wife had perished in a car crash, and they held the funeral just a few days later. Only immediate family members were invited. None arrived from midnight. Camilla Raven. That had been her name before she married Clement and became Camilla Kingsley. But what had they been talking about? Why wouldn't Isabella and her siblings be safe with their grandparents? And who was this random stalker that they were trying to keep them safe from in the first place? Isabella adjusted her seating position again and leaned her head against the cool window. She sighed heavily as she turned up the volume in her headphones, and her mind drifted off to her memory of the joyride that had caused her sudden eviction. For the past 7 years since his wife's death, Clement had been spending most of his time at the hospital where he worked, and Lucas had barely been home either since he started college earlier in the spring. Carmen, who was 4 years younger than Isabella, had a close bond with their nanny and spent most of her time in the family's apartment at the Upper West Side, watching documentaries on the Discovery Channel and reading books far too advanced for her age. She was the pride and joy of the family, although Lucas's time on the football team had proved a worthy adversary until he graduated high school and left home. Isabella, on the other hand, hated being at home. She hated the emptiness of it, the clean and cold furniture that they couldn't get dirty, and she hated all of the memories that she'd had with her mother in that place. When Camilla was still alive, you could almost always hear music in the apartment, and note the scent of a pot of tea brewing or a candle burning. Since then, however, things had been still and silent. The apartment was always void of inhabitants, and when it wasn't, doors were kept shut. A little over a year earlier, when Lucas was busy preparing for his big move away from home and onto his college campus, and Isabella's junior year awaited just beyond the horizon, she had fallen in with the rejected crowd at school, or, in other words, the non-popular kids. Their high school consisted mostly of kids who had been spoiled rotten by their rich and influential parents, and thereby felt entitled to anything and everything. So it was refreshing to meet a group of people who denounced their family's riches as much as Isabella did herself. They taught Isabella about the great wealth inequality that plagued their society, about how those who make the most do the least, and how families are struggling all over to pay rent and feed their kids, while their own families spend thousands of dollars on pointless parties and name-brand items they didn't actually need. This new group of friends fueled Isabella's distaste for the upper class, and unintentionally caused a lot of arguments with her father. She wanted him to donate to a dozen different charities, pointing out that Lucas didn't need a brand new car because he couldn't take the subway, and that this would be better for the environment anyway. But Clement was as stubborn as his daughter and never let her make much headway in this argument. Instead, Isabella settled for a good old-fashioned guilt trip, repeatedly telling her father how many families of each of his belongings could feed. Shockingly, no one seemed to appreciate this quality in Isabella.
Shockingly.
Shockingly. Hey, you need to donate more. Yep. No, like, donate more. Yep. No, like, you didn't need to buy a new Volvo. You could have donated half of that to charity and just bought a piece of shit Camry, which you will also get to work in.
Yeah. Here's a hint. Lucas would not have wanted a Volvo.
What would Lucas have wanted?
Well,
what did Lucas end up getting as his new car?
Unclear.
Unclear. No, no. You have to tell me.
I'm not entirely sure he actually did end up getting a car.
Okay. Well, what kind of car would he have gotten?
The type of car that you would want.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Again, like, they're richer people, like, hey, in New York. Like, they could afford it.
I gotcha.
Yeah.
I'm trying to do the math in my head right now, and a rich family in New York. That's not our type of rich. That's, like, actually really rich.
That's, like, yeah, they're, like, rich and influential.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Just based on what I've heard from Lucas, he seems like the type of guy who's showy, but also kind of puts his money where his mouth is. Just a little bit. Mm-hmm. That's just what I've gathered so far, you know?
Get to know Lucas better.
I feel like he would have an Audi R8.
He would definitely not say no to an Audi R8.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something that just screams, I'm luxury, I'm fast.
Yeah.
But I don't have a Ferrari like some of those douchebags.
Yeah, right? Like, I know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know what good cars are. I don't, but...
I know what good cars are. And you know what? Who cares about reliability? We don't need it. We have money.
Yeah.
We can afford to spend $1,000 on an oil change. Don't do that, by the way. Don't.
God.
That's not.
That kind of spending stresses me out.
Oh, I know. The people that can go through, like, $100,000 in one day, I'm just like, how?
What kind of lives
How?
do you live?
Did you buy a helicopter or something?
Yeah, for real.
Like, it astonishes me. But
yeah, crazy.
Lucas frequently told her off for being such an annoying social justice warrior, arguing that it wasn't Isabella's money anyway, so it wasn't her place to tell their father how to spend it, and would generally criticize anything Isabella enjoyed spending time on. He didn't like her interest in true crime and artsy things, he didn't like her taste in music, and he definitely didn't like her new friends. It was like nothing Isabella had ever did was right in her family's eyes. In spite of this, she and her father had spent the entire summer doing things that they knew would make their parents upset, and Isabella had never felt more free. She knew that she was pushing her father's boundaries, but she didn't care. The night the joyride took place in the fall, well into Isabella's senior year, and Nicole had invited her to a party in the Bronx. She even found them a ride through one of her cousins. It wasn't necessarily their fault that the ride turned out to be stolen, but when the cop car pulled them over, the officer wouldn't hear any of it and arrested Nicole's cousin on the spot. Isabella figured that he'd probably deserved it if he stole someone's car, but felt that it was unnecessary for herself and Nicole to be taken into custody as well, and they had to endure a long and sleepless night in the police station. Once they awoke the following morning, parents had been notified and were arriving with their usual army of lawyers. It wouldn't have been as big a deal if it had been Isabella's first offense, but alas, this was not the case. Over the summer holidays, Isabella and her friends had gotten caught in various bad situations on at least 3 separate occasions. The first time was when they broke into a neglected and run-down old apartment building to mess around with an Ouija board. The second had been when they were caught red-handed stealing alcohol from Attila's parents, and the third had happened when they snaked the keys to Philip's dad's yacht and took it out for a late-night private party. That sounds lit as hell!
I go.
I'd go too, honestly. Admittedly, their offenses had become increasingly bad as the time went on, but Isabella held firm to her belief that it wasn't her fault. If she didn't feel the need to escape their apartment so badly, then maybe she wouldn't have felt such a strong need to get out. However, this was not an easy point to get across to a furious Clement. His ears were practically steaming with rage when he appeared in the police station, their attorney and old family friend by his side. I guess I got what I wanted, Isabella muttered under her breath as she pulled her beanie further down on her head and focused her attention on the landscape that was rushing by on the other side of the train window. She wouldn't be going back to the apartment for some time, that was sure. Then suddenly, she sat up straight. Something impossible had stood grazing in a pasture, but it was impossible. For several minutes, Isabella's gaze was firmly locked on the blurry countryside, scouring it for movement. She could barely breathe as she waited for the impossible thing to reappear, but it was gone. She glanced nervously at the neighbors in her train cart, wondering if any of them had seen anything out of the ordinary during their journey, but they all continued with their train ride activities. Noses remained glued to their books, crayons continued to color, and pillows were left behind their owners' necks and backs. There was no sign of that any of them had seen anything. Not quite satisfied yet, at a loss for what else to do, Isabella melted back into her seat. She pulled her knees up to her chest and fixed her eyes on a window once more, determined to believe that what she'd seen had been nothing more than her own overactive imagination. Before long, Isabella was falling into a deep slumber. What she had seen hadn't been possible. Centaurs simply didn't exist. Isabella awoke several hours later, hunched up in the small seat and with her beanie pulled low. She adjusted her hat as she yawned, her eyes immediately moving to the window to search for impossible creatures. The sun hung low outside, and the bright countryside had been replaced with a tall, dark forest that surrounded the train station on all sides. But there were no monsters in sight. Shaking the ludicrous thought from her head, Isabella waited for the train to come to a stop at her station. As she walked through the train platform with her suitcase rolling noisily behind her, Isabella noted that several of the other passengers seemed thoroughly unnerved by the forest's looming presence. It was odd. Even though the sea of trees created a thick and seemingly impenetrable boundary around the train station, Isabella appreciated the feeling of safety that it gave her. She'd always liked trees and how unmovable and proud they seemed. Outside the platform, a tall and gangly man wearing a pinstripe suit stood waiting next to an old and shiny black car holding up a simple paper sign bearing Isabella's name. Noting to herself how bizarre it was that the man was wearing a pair of dark sunglasses, in spite of the sun already sinking low beyond the treetops, she walked toward him. Gosh. Even though there was still several feet of distance between them, Isabella felt something cold and dangerous radiating off of this man, and, although it wasn't intentional, her pace slowed significantly as she drew nearer. The man smiled at her, raising one of his hands and waving at her, and suddenly Isabella stopped dead in her tracks. For just a moment, she could have sworn that the man had fangs. But this, just like the centaurs she'd thought she'd seen from the train, was just not possible. Deciding that it was probably just paranoia after the extraordinarily long night and the stressful train ride, Isabella kept on walking. When she at last stood before the strange man, he held out a hand and shook her own notably warmer counterpart, then brought her suitcase around to the trunk of the car. As Isabella stepped into the back seat and settled into its soft leather seats, she noticed how the forest seemed to stretch out from either side of the train station, opening up into a large rectangle. It was within this rectangle that the small town of Midnight was located, a place long forgotten by the rest of the country, but wildly beloved by its some 20,000 inhabitants, at least according to its website. Feeling somewhat on edge, Isabella made sure to avoid the man's sight as he entered the vehicle and started it up. The car hummed softly as the awkward pair left the train station behind and turned onto the cobblestone streets of Midnight, passing a variety of buildings that Isabella would later learn included the high school, an elementary school, a tiny post office, an ancient and decrepit-looking library, an abandoned-looking and round church with an adjourned graveyard, and a number of other unidentified businesses. After about 20 minutes, the car that carried Isabella and her new friend took a turn down a long and winding road that was surrounded by pine trees, and which eventually spat them out into a smaller clearing that lay hidden by the dense forest, about a mile away from the town. As the car slowed to a stop, Isabella leaned closer to her window and critically scanned the home of her grandparents. The Raven Mansion was an old and altogether creepy, and although it was clear that the building had once been painted black, the paint had since faded into gray and was peeling all over. Due to its tall and slim design, the mansion looked slightly lopsided as it reached further towards the sky than its structure ought to be able to support. Isabella had... Can you stop?
No.
Oh my
wow.
God.
You narrowly avoided that tripod, girl.
She's making me so nervous.
Oh, look at things. She just waddled into the bedroom.
Yeah.
The Raven Mansion was creepy. And it's reaching toward the sky.
Yep, there we go. There it is. Isabella had always been under the impression that her mother had married into wealth, but if this had been her childhood home, then she must come from a family that was equally as well off as the Kingsleys. Isabella slowly opened her car door and stepped outside, taking in as many details of the mansion as she could. At least a third of the 24 windows were cracked, adding to the strong feeling of neglect, but the garden that surrounded the house was perfectly maintained and housed dozens of plants that Isabella had never before seen in her life. And toward the northeast corner of the ground stood a small shack with a wooden door and a thin chimney that expelled a plume of multicolored smoke. "Looks like your grandfather is cooking again," the chauffeur commented in a distant sort of voice as he brought Isabella's luggage to the enormous front door of the mansion. The silver knocker that hung at chest height looked ancient and worn, but you could still clearly see the features of the silver raven it had once been. The chauffeur gave Isabella an encouraging nod, and she picked up the heavy knocker. 2 deep, echoing knocks sounded within the mansion. Barely 2 seconds had passed before the large wooden doors swung open and revealed an elderly woman with bright, white hair that hung in voluminous ringlets down her shoulders. She was a slight woman, thin and barely 5 feet tall, but her eyes were bright gray and they shone with happiness. The old woman's general appearance matched with her bright green suspenders and flowery blouse made her look certifiably insane in Isabella's eyes, but she swallowed her initial judgments and smiled at the woman. "Dear child!" The old woman burst out and pulled Isabella into a strong-armed, lavender-scented hug. Isabella patted her new grandmother softly on the back, not really sure what else to do, and glanced curiously around the entry room that expanded behind the elderly woman. Elderly little woman, specifically.
She's not big.
She's not big. She's a small one. It was dimly lit and somewhat smoky, and there was an odd selection of picture frames and mirrors covering every inch of the walls. She could see a rickety staircase disappear into the ceiling, and a wide assortment of strange objects crammed onto shelves and side tables, and the scent of fresh food and multiple unnamed herbs hung thick in the air. "Come in, come in!" Isabella's grandmother suddenly released her from her tight grip and ushered the 2 newcomers inside. The chauffeur immediately disappeared up the staircase with Isabella's suitcase, while the 2 women stepped through the empty door frame into a smaller room with a fireplace and several plush and brightly colored armchairs. Grandmother Raven invited Isabella to take a seat in one of the chairs directly in front of the fireplace as she sat in the other, and the 2 of them sat in silent observation for several minutes. Isabella kept finding new and intriguing things to look at in every direction, admiring the lack of coherence in this strange place, while also feeling that some kind of central theme could probably help it look better. Whereas her grandmother appeared content just watching her. "You look so much like your mother," she smiled after a moment, but her voice sounded so mournful that Isabella gave an involuntary gulp. "Sorry," she muttered, and her eyes fell to her hands where they rested in her lap. Clement used to tell her the same thing, before Camilla died, but she hadn't heard it since the funeral. Lucas and Carmen rarely spoke about her, and Clement never did. Grandmother Raven, on the other hand, just kept on smiling, even though her eyes had taken on a solemn look, as if she knew exactly what Isabella was feeling. "I know it must be strange to be here with us," she told Isabella quietly. "A family of strangers. But you should know that we don't blame Camilla for the choices she made. We're all just happy you're here now." Isabella's eyes snapped up to her grandmother in surprise. "All?" she repeated. "Who else lives here besides you and, Grandpa?" "Well, let's see." Her grandmother held up her hand and began to count them off on her fingers. "There's Victor, of course, the chauffeur. You already met him. Then there's your grandfather, Tom, your Uncle Omar, and Cousin Sam, as well as all of the animals who just so happen to find a home here with us." Isabella's face fell as her heart jerked uncomfortably, and she started picking at the stitching of her armchair. "I have an uncle? And a cousin?" she asked in a would-be nonchalant voice, but it was clear that Grandmother Raven could see through it. "Your mother was a very complicated person," she explained hesitantly. "I think she was always a little bit embarrassed by us. That's why she left us as soon as she did. And I believe I'm incorrect in my assumption that she never looked back?" Isabella nodded dejectedly. "She never even talked about you." The briefest of smiles crossed the old woman's lips. "Camilla never enjoyed her life in Midnight." Grandmother Raven admitted heavily. I don't like that. Camilla never enjoyed her life in Midnight, Grandmother Raven admitted heavily. But instead of trying to improve the situation, she blamed those closest to her and acted out. She acted like what she was, a child. You can't really blame her for that. Isabella noticed that Grandmother Raven didn't sound upset about this, even though she had every right to, and she also couldn't help but see a resemblance between herself and Camilla. Isabella had blamed her father for making her feel miserable too, but she'd always known deep down that she'd been in the right. Now, she wasn't so sure. Grandmother Raven watched her granddaughter with a great deal of regret and grief weighing in her chest. Isabella had grown so much since she last saw her on the back of a postcard that had been sent nearly a decade ago. Now she sat there in the soft glow of the fire, a near full-grown woman who looked so much like Camilla that it was almost startling. Isabella had had her mother's dark curls, her silver eyes, and the same soft facial features. At long last, her lost little bird had come home. That's so sweet.
Yeah. I love the voice that you picked for Birdie because it's so far from what I've always pictured.
Birdie, the grandmother?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Her name hasn't been revealed yet, has
Oh.
it?
Whoops. Spoilers.
Wow.
It's not unusual for a young person to blame her upbringing for the letdowns in her life, the old woman told Isabella kindly. I don't blame Kim for wanting to leave, much as I don't think your father blames you for acting out. But it's important to remember that your family can only help you as much as you let them. Their eyes met for a moment. In spite of the guilt Isabella felt stir in the pit of her stomach, she appreciated her grandmother's words. It was nice to hear that even though her mother had blamed her family and even cut them out of her life completely, her parents still loved her. Now, let's get you some food, huh? Grandmother Raven gave Isabella a clap on the shoulder and stood up. She was slightly shorter than Isabella, but seemed surprisingly spry and energetic for her age, which, to be fair, could be anywhere between 45 and 100 as far as Isabella could tell. The two of them left a small room with a fireplace and ventured further into the house, into a kitchen that more so resembled a dungeon. The walls were made of kind of stone that Isabella didn't recognize, and the stones were etched with random words and images that looked like they'd been left there centuries ago, and there were several large windows that allowed for plenty of sunlight. From the ceiling hung a wide variety of herbs and plants, most likely the source of the strong herbal scent that flowed throughout the house, and several pots and pans filled to the brim with pleasant-smelling food stood waiting on the industrial-sized stovetop. Isabella peered curiously into the nearest pot as she followed her grandmother through the spacious kitchen. She couldn't wait to eat whatever it was that was in there. An oak table large enough to fit 20 stood in a spacious nook that sat just past an opening in the west corner of the kitchen, and at the head of the table sat a handsome, muscular man with jet black eyes, dark skin, and a head full of dreadlocks. The braids were decorated with silver and bronze beads, and he wore a heavy set of jewelry around his neck, wrists, and fingers, and the long black robe he was wearing had been intricately embroidered in silver. Wow, this is a fancy man.
Oh, yeah, he has good taste.
Holy shit. I'm imagining,
yeah?
a Jamaican Heimdall type of person.
Like Heimdall?
Heimdall from Thor, the guy with the big sword that controls
yeah. Okay, yeah, actually, that's a very good depiction of what to picture him.
Sweet.
To be like, yeah, wait, that's so funny. Because that's exactly how I've always pictured him.
Sweet.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it was just like, wait, he seems mysterious. He's got all of this nice fancy jewelry. He's got the big dreadlocks. He's got the nice beads in the dreadlocks. Like, this is definitely a Heimdall type of character, but maybe with a little bit of Jamaican twist on him.
He likes it fancy too.
Well, one thing's for sure, Jamaican me curious.
That's cute.
To the man's left sat a smaller character with spiky, electric blue hair and vividly green eyes. Both of them watched Isabella closely as Grandmother Raven took a seat at the table, gesturing for the young girl to do the same. Everyone, I would like to introduce you to Isabella. The old lady announced with so much pride in her voice that she might be announcing the arrival of royalty, not family. Charmed to meet you, Isabella. The large man grinned pleasantly as Isabella took a seat to his right. She gave him a nervous smile and shook his hand in spite of an awkward angle. "It's just Izzy," she told him, not wanting Isabella to stick. Clement was the only one who called her that, and it was a name that was usually saved for unpleasant situations. I'm your Uncle Omar," the man replied happily. Do you like how I switched his voice up? We're going to go with that second one.
Yeah, the second one is...
I know. I could feel that as soon as I said the first line. I was like,
Pleasure to meet you. I was like, well, he's not British.
Pleasure to meet you, says the
Pleasure.
Jamaican Heimdall.
Hey, I'm just hearing it in Hermione's voice.
Oh, yeah, that's exactly what I was... Yeah, absolutely. Pleasure. Pleasure. We need to get back to this.
Yeah.
I'm your Uncle Omar, the man replied happily. And this is my kid Sam. Sam gave a near imperceptible nod from across the table, but kept their eyes fixed unblinkingly on Izzy. "It's a pleasure to meet you," she managed, but she wasn't sure how true it was. So far, Izzy's extended family had been nothing like she'd expected, in more ways than the number of members, and she couldn't yet say whether or not this was a good thing. In New York, this group might have resembled any other oddball or artistic family that took up residence, but in a town as small as Midnight, well, Izzy wouldn't expect any of them to be voted onto the city council anytime soon. "Bertie, is that husband of yours coming in for dinner or not?" Omar asked as Grandmother Raven began filling the table with dishes and serving tools, and Izzy suddenly remembered that the comment Victor the chauffeur had made as they arrived. "Isn't Grandfa..." Izzy stumbled on her words as she failed to come up with a good name for her new relatives, and was pleasantly surprised when Sam came to her rescue. We just call them Bertie and Tom," they told her. Izzy met her cousin's static gaze again, just briefly, and gave them a grateful nod, but those electric green eyes were unnerving. "Victor said that it looked like Tom was cooking again when we pulled up," she continued now that she had the words. "Did he cook all of this food? It smells amazing." Omar and Sam exchanged an oddly bemused look, but Bertie just continued to smile and placed a healthy serving of cheesy potatoes on Izzy's plate. "Tom does his own form of cooking out in his shed," she stated. "But Omar and I make most of the food around here." Izzy noted the random use of the words make rather than cook, but decided not to think about it any further and simply nodded. Instead, she accepted the plate of food and sat back to watch if they were going to say grace before eating. Her mom had always made them say grace, but Clement hadn't been able to keep up the tradition, with never being around, so Izzy figured it was probably a family habit. "I'm sure he'll come in and join us when he's ready," Omar shrugged as he accepted his own plate, tearing into his large turkey leg with such ferocity that Izzy couldn't help but stare. As she looked around the table, Izzy wondered what her grandfather would look like. She had assumed that he looked like Omar because her uncle hardly resembled Bertie at all, but Sam didn't exactly look like their father either. The only thing the three Ravens really had in common were their noses and warm smiles. When Izzy finally took a hesitant bite of her own food, still halfway expecting one of the Ravens to berate her for eating before saying grace, she watched with confused amazement as Bertie dished out an astonishing serving size for herself and her husband. Meanwhile, Sam's hands flew all over the table, grabbing an assortment of sides from their various dishes, and somewhere around Omar's third turkey leg, he began to resemble a bear more than a man. Clearly, this family knew how to eat right, but this homey setting was far from the modest and expensive meals Izzy often enjoyed at home at the hands of Clement's extraordinarily talented hired chef. Not chef.
Nice.
However, Izzy quickly realized just how amazing the food in front of her actually was, and once she had taken her first bite of the golden turkey leg, she suddenly understood her uncle's instinct to devour as many as possible. How many legs does this turkey have?
Who says they're only eating one turkey?
Oh my gosh, that's a good point. Actually, I didn't even think about that. But the main course was followed by an equally excellent dessert, made up of homemade ice cream and brownies and a pot of tea, but Tom's plate had been left untouched on the table. Izzy would have asked if this was strange behavior, since she and her siblings had never been allowed to miss dinner when their mom was around, but no one seemed to question his absence. They were all sipping their teas in constant silence, each relishing it in the aftermath of their wonderful meal, until Bertie suddenly slammed her hands on the table and stood up, a heaving great sigh. Yeah. Well, I suppose we can't sit here all night, the old woman sighed as she stretched out her arms in front of her, releasing a number of disturbing cracks and pops. Oof. Noting that it was time to clear off the table, Izzy went to grab some dishes, only to find Omar sweeping in to grab them first, casting a meaningful glance at Bertie. Don't you think the kids might be better off elsewhere? He asked pointedly. Oh, right. Bertie looked slightly startled, and her eyes flickered to the ceiling for a moment. Sam, would you show Izzy to her bedroom? Sam raised an inquisitive eyebrow at their dad, but then nodded and waved for Izzy to follow them out of the kitchen. As they were leaving, Izzy glanced back at Bertie and Omar, who continued to clear the table. She had the distinct impression that she had just missed something important, and if there was something Izzy hated, it was being left out. However, Izzy was quickly forced to forget about this curious exchange, as she realized that Sam was a ridiculously fast walker, and she had to work hard not to fall behind as her cousin led her up the set of stairs that Izzy had seen in the entry room earlier, and then on through the house. However,
Really?
Yeah. However, with the increased speed and the random twists and turns within the strange mansion, Izzy had to stay at a near sprint to keep up with her cousin, who consistently stayed several steps ahead. When Sam, a few minutes later, came to an abrupt stop, one mistimed step was all it took to send Izzy slamming into her cousin's back. The force of the collision knocked Izzy both off balance and off her step, and she was about to go tumbling back down the stairs when Sam's hand caught her wrist and pulled her back. Wow! Izzy gasped as she found her balance once more. Good reflexes. She gave Sam a grin, but they just stared right back, as unblinking as ever. Why are you here? They asked her in an indecipherable tone of voice. Izzy frowned. I thought Bertie would have told you, but I guess... She awkwardly let her words trail off as she watched Sam, waiting for a response of any kind, but they just kept watching her in silence. I got caught doing something stupid, she admitted after an uncomfortable few seconds. So my dad decided to send me here. As a punishment? Sam asked, a slight crease forming on their brow. I'm not sure, Izzy replied honestly. He just said that he thought I needed a firmer hand to guide me, and that if he couldn't do that, then maybe my grandparents could. Sam gave a short nod, then indicated for the two of them to continue up the stairs. Not quite sure what to think about her new cousin just yet, Izzy let her eyes float back to the walls to observe the oddities that hung there. She spotted a number of creepy portraits, a few frames containing dead insects and butterflies, and some old photographs of what she assumed were distant relatives. Every once in a while, the pair would pass one of the mansion's many mirrors, and every time, without fail, Izzy thought she saw a shadow moving across the glass. But then, when she looked back, she'd find nothing out of place. The whole place was slightly unnerving. Don't you have siblings? Sam suddenly asked after the pair had walked in silence for several minutes. They'd passed two floors by now, and were coming up on a mid-stair landing where a beautiful blown glass window covered an entire wall. That's gorgeous.
Mm-hmm.
Izzy snuck a peek through the window as they passed and just managed to catch a glimpse of a huge, dark shadow moving across the lawn toward the mansion. I do, she replied absent-mindedly as she watched the large shadow disappear from view. Lucas just started his sophomore year at NYU, and Carmen just turned 13. They're still in New York? Sam followed up, and Izzy nodded. Her eyes still turned to the now empty lawn. They didn't get caught riding around in a stolen car, so they got to stay, she explained, and once again almost slammed straight into Sam's back as they came to a sudden stop, but this time she managed to catch herself and landed safely on the step below. Sam turned around and, for the first time since they'd met, they were smiling. It was a sympathetic sort of grin, but still. I'm sorry your dad's such a dick. I just love that. Just, sorry your dad's a dick.
Yeah.
Sorry your dad's such a dick, they told Izzy with a sincere voice. But we're all glad you're here now. It's all right, Izzy said through a sort of snort. but the smile it prompted remained glued on her face for several more minutes as Sam led them through another floor. It wasn't often that people made Izzy feel like she was right to criticize her father. She was frequently surrounded by people who saw Dr. Clement as a mastermind, and thereby viewed Izzy as an insolent child. Gross. So it was nice to have someone justify her side of things for once. I wanted to finish that sentence.
Gross.
You insolent child, listen to your surgeon of a father. Fuck you!
I mean, that's pretty much what Izzy thinks all day, every day.
Yeah, I imagine so.
I love that last time we read this, you were like, she's kind of a brat. And this time you're like, yeah, she's right.
I'm gonna say yes to both opinions, because she is kind of a brat,
hey,
but also I get it sometimes.
Both can be true. Both can be true.
Yeah. When they'd reached the third floor, the pair finally left the stairs behind and made a right turn into the dimly lit hallway. Again, there was a mirror on the wall where Izzy briefly saw a shadow flitting past, but there was nothing compared to the ominous portraits that lined the hallway. They were ancient and covered in a thick layer of dust, and each portrait made Izzy feel like she was being watched. Who are all these people? She asked, frowning at a particularly unpleasant old man in a black stovepipe hat and a ridiculously well-kept mustache. Sam just shrugged and kept moving forward, something which did not help Izzy to settle her nerves. At the end of the hallway, they reached a fork in the road, which is usually pretty uncommon in houses, and Sam was about to lead them down the corridor on their left when the door on their right swung open in an eerie fashion. Izzy's eyes grew huge at the sight of this, and she immediately looked over at Sam, who looked thoroughly bored at the spooky happenings. "What's in there?" Izzy asked, trying to keep her voice steady as she nodded toward the door on their right. Sam shrugged in an "I don't know, and I don't care" kind of way, and leaned against the wall behind them, clearly expecting Izzy to go exploring. Silently reevaluating her new family members within the privacy of her mind, Izzy turned around and walked briskly to the door that had just swung open. If there was a ghost in there, she was determined to find out one way or another. The room she entered was small, pitch black, and almost completely empty. It took a couple of moments for her eyes to get used to the darkness, but Izzy could soon make out the shape of one lonely window that was covered by a black and bunched-up sheet, a stubby and worn dresser, and a single wardrobe that resembled a coffin in an inappropriately disturbing fashion. Suddenly grabbed by an urge to run, Izzy took a deep breath, calmly grabbed the doorknob, and closed the door firmly behind her, walking back over to Sam. "I think I'll ignore that room for now," she muttered, and then the two of them continued to the left. A couple of minutes later, Sam finally came to a stop in front of a painting of an old oak tree. They ran their fingers down the trunk of the tree within a few seconds, a brass doorknob had popped into existence on the right edge of the picture frame. Izzy blinked a couple of times and stared curiously at Sam, who completely ignored her surprised expression, and opened the door which had not been there a minute earlier. "This is your room," they stated simply as Izzy followed them into the room that didn't exist. To open the door, just stroke the tree trunk. It wasn't exactly what Izzy had expected, although having any expectations at all had begun to feel pretty meaningless at this point. Clearly, this family and their home did not care about what you expected them to be and do. Izzy's room was circular, somehow, and looked like it came from a fairy tale rather than an odd-looking house in the middle of nowhere, Maine. But it was so beautiful that Izzy felt compelled to ignore all of her previous misgivings about the mansion and its bizarre inhabitants. The bed was spacious and housed probably 100 pillows, and an intricately decorated mirror stood next to it. The room contained several large windows with accompanying curtains, and one of the windows had been fashioned into a little reading nook with a convenient side table and everything. There were also several bookcases which held a large number of books and assorted knickknacks, a huge desk with a chair, and a round target even hung on the wall. At first glance, it looked like an archery target, but Izzy knew instinctively that it was for her throwing knives. Ooh. By some impossible feat of architecture, the room also held two additional doors, which led into a walk-in closet and a private bedroom. Bathroom, not bedroom. She's already in a bedroom. This is a bathroom.
I was like, I'm pretty sure I didn't say bedroom there.
No, it's a bathroom.
It's a bathroom.
This is amazing. Izzy shook her head in disbelief as her eyes continued to sweep across the room. It's like someone asked me what my dream bedroom would be and then built it. Sam nodded knowingly. This place is so old that none of us know what it originally looked like. Instead, we'll just stumble up on the new rooms and features as they're added. I haven't ever noticed this room before. Izzy stared at them and bewildered. It was a big mansion, sure, but Sam clearly knew their way around, and it seemed strange that they had missed a whole room until now. However, there was nothing about this place that didn't seem strange or surprising, and considering Sam's talent for tuning other people out when they talk, maybe it was just a coincidence that they'd missed it. Maybe Bertie and Tom were really into home renovation? It looks like that walk-in closet is brand new, though, Sam noted with a nod to one of the doors that Izzy hadn't opened yet. How can you tell? Izzy asked curiously. The frame doesn't match the other two, Sam replied logically, then frowned and looked at Izzy. Did you bring a lot of clothes with you? Why does it matter if I brought a lot of clothes with me? She replied with mounting suspicions. What difference would that make? Sam's face fell back to its old, inscrutable form as they shrugged, turning to walk back into the corridor outside and leaving Izzy in her room waiting for an explanation. But the conversation had apparently ended there. Reluctantly, Izzy followed them a bit further down the hallway, Sam's pace significantly faster now, and she couldn't help but wonder if they were rushing through the tour in order to get rid of her. Here's my room, Sam suddenly announced in front of a large painting depicting a gorgeous ocean view, those great blue waves appearing so realistic in spite of being frozen in time, building and crashing all at once. Izzy looked curiously between the painting and Sam, waiting for a similar display of unexpected strangeness as the one she'd seen by her own room, but this just led to the pair of them simply standing there. That's awkward.
Yeah, that's great.
Do you sleep here in the hallway, then? Izzy asked after a couple minutes had passed by in the silence. Neither one moving an inch, but Sam didn't reply. Instead, they turned their eyes towards something behind Izzy. I think Bertie's ready to see you, Sam told Izzy hurriedly, just as she turned around to see what they'd been looking at. But Izzy still caught a glimpse of some dark shadow disappearing past the edge of the mirror. She spun back around and was about to demand some real answers from Sam when she realized that they had already left her behind, their feet barely visible as they disappeared in a spiral staircase at the end of the hallway. Sam, wait! Izzy called as she ran after them, but shouting was apparently useless because Sam was gone. At the top of the metal steps, Izzy found herself in yet another room that looked like it belonged in an ancient castle rather than this strange old mansion. A thick scent of burning herbs lingered in the air and tickled Izzy's throat as she squatted around the darkness. Squinted around the darkness. She just walked around the room squatting like a duck walk.
I always pictured like a crab person just like squatting around, like fucking Zoidberg in Futurama.
That would have been the creepiest thing in this whole book so far. Just seeing a random person just.
I'm gonna squat around this mansion.
The room she'd entered was pitch black and contained no windows and apparently no lights. And instead of a ceiling, Izzy was met with a clear view of the night sky when she looked upward. The stars shone directly onto the ancient stone floor, and Izzy noted that these were the same kind of stones that had been used in the kitchen. The two rooms must somehow have been built at the same time. Yeah, one's really high up versus the other. That's a little weird. Izzy's eyes finally descended from the impossible sky that hung above, having adjusted somewhat to the deep darkness. Her gaze swept across the rest of the room and took in everything from the tables and shelves that were crammed full of worn-out copies of old books and scrolls, to the various seating poofs and chairs that were scattered around the room. Finally, the girl's eyes came to land on a large, cast-iron cauldron that stood alone atop a rickety little table. As the thick aroma of herbs and candles began to fill her head, Izzy finally noticed two shapes standing in front of a dark and empty fireplace, and she took 2 careful steps further into the room. The shapes came forward too, and Izzy identified them as Bertie and Sam, but they were both looking at her with curious and uncertain eyes. What do we think of our home so far? Bertie asked with a slightly tense voice. Izzy couldn't really bring herself to do anything but to nod slowly. What did they expect her to say? They had all been acting weird and secretive since the moment Izzy had arrived, and the mansion itself felt strangely alive. Bertie smiled encouragingly. It's a bit strange, yes? You could say that, Izzy agreed apprehensively. I think you'll come to find that the people who live here are quite as strange as their home. Are as strange as their home. Yeah, that's the line. Yeah. That's the line.
Yeah, that's the line.
Bertie continued as she walked into the center of the room and dropped 3 seat cushions on the floor, directly beneath the stairs. Izzy didn't doubt her statement for 1 second. I'm sure you have quite a few questions about what you've seen today. Bertie spoke as she sat down on one of the cushions, Sam following suit. And although I will answer them in due time, I think it's time for a story. A story? Izzy repeated before she could stop herself, approaching her grandmother and cousins and taking a seat on the last seat cushion. A story wasn't exactly what she'd expected or what she wanted, but Izzy held her tongue and resigned herself to wait patiently. Bertie did say that she was going to answer her questions after all, so Izzy would just have to take her word for it. The silver-haired woman gestured to Sam, who placed a set of candles on the floor between the 3 of them, and then, with a secretive smile, she lit them with a simple snap of her fingers. In order to fully understand this place and the history of our family, you need to hear how our town came to be. I'll try to be brief. This is the story of Midnight. And that is the end of the chapter, and where we are going to end this episode today.
Yeah, we are, because, it's already plenty long.
Oh, yeah. It's about 1 chapter at a time. That's what we're going to say.
Yeah. The next chapter is, really short, so we might do 2.
Or we might just do the 1,
Yeah, we'll see.
We'll see. It's hard to tell.
Yeah.
Because I think the one after that is pretty long, too.
Yeah, that's very possible.
Yeah, it definitely is.
Yeah.
So we'll probably just do the 1. But this is the general vibe that we're going to go with. We're going to read 1 chapter per episode and get all the way through this first book, which is very exciting. It's 129 of these pages. It's like full word pages.
Yeah, it's more than 129. That's just when the last chapter starts.
Yeah, this isn't the fucking Hobbit that's like this big and each chapter is like 20 pages. No. If this was the Hobbit, a chapter would be like 50 pages or 60 pages. So, I think anyway.
You don't have to finish a chapter every time you read. That's just this is just where the story went.
What?
Whenever you're reading a book, just stop whenever you feel like you need to stop. You don't have to finish a chapter.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not saying the chapters are incorrectly spaced, because I actually think that's a very good place to end the chapter at.
Yeah, right? It would have felt weird if it stopped anywhere, sooner.
Yeah, it definitely would have.
Yeah.
So, but yeah. Thank you for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed it. I am excited to see where this is going to go next.
Yeah, excited to hear the story of Midnight.
Ooh, I am very excited to hear the story of Midnight.
Yeah.
For those who want to know, the next chapter is called The Story. Shocker. I know, right? It's
I mean, who could have
huge shocker. But yeah, thank you for tuning in. We'll
catch you later.
We'll see you on the next episode. Bye-bye.
Cute.
Oh, yeah.
Clink.